The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker, turning the alleyway behind the chaotic sprawl of Pike Place into a throat of black asphalt and wet brick. It was a cold, miserable Tuesday, the kind that seeped through the seams of a coat and settled into the marrow. Elias Thorne adjusted his grip on the flashlight, the beam cutting an erratic, jaundice-yellow cone through the downpour. 32, Elias wore the city like a bruise. His knuckles were scarred from years of coaxing music out of warped wood and rusted steel. His eyes perpetually squinting against the neon glare of a world he couldn't quite afford to live in. He was a luthier by trade, a scavenger. The tip came from a busboy at the Jazz Alley, a kid who traded information for guitar strings. Old man died in the penthouse above the venue. Family cleared it out, tossed the junk in the back. I saw leather cases, Elias. Leather cases usually meant nothing. Sometimes they meant a shattered violin or a clarinet that smelled like mildew and regret. But Elias had the sickness. He kicked aside a sodden cardboard box labeled fragile. Nothing but packing peanuts dissolved into white sludge. He moved deeper into the shadows, where the dumpsters formed a rusted canyon. The smell was distinct: rotting vegetable matter, stale beer, and the metallic tang of ozone. Then he saw it. It wasn't sitting on top of the trash. It was wedged between a grease drum. Elias froze. The silhouette was unmistakable to anyone who had spent their life worshipping at the altar of the sixth string. It was an hourglass shape, wide at the hips, pinched at the waist. He stepped closer, the water splashing over the tops of his worn boots. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the recognition. It was a hard-shell case, covered in brown Tolex that mimicked alligator skin. He wiped them. It was a 1950s Lifton case, the legendary California Girl case, known for its pink plush lining and its association with the holy grail of electric guitars, the Gibson Les Paul. Elias looked around. His shoulder socket popped with a sharp flare of pain. The case barely moved. Elias frowned, planting his feet firmer in the slush. He gripped the handle with both hands and heaved. The case came up, but it felt dense, impossibly solid, as if it were filled with lead shot or wet concrete. It swung heavily against his thigh, nearly knocking him off balance. "What in the hell?" he muttered. He dragged it out of the shadows and under the partial shelter of a fire escape overhang. He needed to look. He needed to know before he walked 5 blocks back to his shop. He knelt in the grime, clicking the latches. There were 5 of them, a hallmark of the high-end vintage cases. They were oxidized, stubborn. Snap, snap. The smell hit him before the sight did. It wasn't the smell of rot. It was the sweet, intoxicating scent of nitrocellulose lacquer, old mahogany, and a faint, chemical sharp tang he couldn't place. Inside, nestled in the shocking pink plush that looked impossibly bright against the drab alley, lay a guitar. "No," Elias breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. No way. If this was real, if this was a 58, 59, or 60, he was looking at $250,000 sitting in a puddle of Seattle rain. He reached out to touch the neck. It had the profile of a 59, not the baseball bat of the 58, not the slim taper of the 60. It was the Goldilocks. He closed the lid, his mind racing. Why was the case so heavy? A Les Paul was heavy, sure, but this felt like he was carrying a corpse. He snapped the latches shut. He didn't care about the weight right now. He had to get off the street. If anyone saw him, if Julian Vane found out he was walking around with a burst, Elias wouldn't just lose the guitar. The workshop, Thorne's Vintage Repair, was located in the basement of a defunct textile factory in Pioneer Square. It was a sanctuary of sawdust and solitude. The walls were lined with clamps, chisels, and the skeletal remains of instruments waiting for resurrection. Elias slammed the heavy steel door behind him and threw the deadbolt. He was soaking wet, shivering, his coat heavy with rainwater, but he stripped it off and tossed it into the corner without looking. All that mattered was the case. He needed Sarah. He needed Docs. He fished his phone out of his jeans. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb over the digital display. He dialed. "It's 2 in the morning, Elias." the voice on the other end said. It was crisp, annoyed, but alert. Sarah Miller didn't sleep. She researched. She was an archivist for the Museum of Pop Culture, a woman who could date a Fender Telecaster by the smell of the solder. I found something, Elias said, his voice ragged. You found a bottle of whiskey? Or trouble? There was a pause on the line. The rustle of papers stopped. Where? Alley behind the jazz. Some estate clear out. And there's a burst inside, Sarah. A real one. T-burst finish. KF pickups. The works. Elias. Sarah's tone shifted from annoyance to pity. Do you know the odds of finding a 59 burst in an alley? You have a better chance of being struck by lightning while winning the lottery. I know the odds. Elias snapped, running a hand through his damp hair. But I'm looking at it. It's the weight, Elias said. The case. It weighs, 40 pounds? 50? I nearly dislocated my shoulder lifting it. Maybe it's waterlogged? No. The leather is wet, but the wood structure is solid. The weight is dense. Feels wrong, Sarah. It feels discordant. Discordant, she repeated. You always were dramatic. Look, bring it by the archives tomorrow. I can run the serial number, check the provenance. If it's a forgery, it's probably a chipson filled with lead weights to fool a buyer. It's not a forgery. The lacquer checking. The smell. You can't fake 70 years of oxidation. Bring it. He hung up. The silence of the shop pressed in on him. He turned back to the case. He opened it again. The guitar lay there, magnificent and arrogant. He carefully lifted the instrument out. It was heavy, yes, solid mahogany and maple cap, but it was standard Les Paul weight. Maybe 9 pounds. He set the guitar gently on a padded stand. Then he turned back to the empty case. Elias frowned. An empty guitar case should be light, plywood, leather, plush. This thing felt like it was lined with iron. He ran his hands over the pink plush interior. He pressed down on the bottom where the body of the guitar would rest. It was hard, unyielding. He knocked on it. Thud. It didn't sound like plywood. It sounded metallic. He gripped the sides of the accessory box and wiggled it. It was loose. Elias grabbed a pair of pliers from his wall. He felt a pang of guilt. Damaging a vintage Lifton case was a sin in his book, but the curiosity was a physical itch he couldn't scratch. He gripped the edge of the plush lining near the accessory box and pulled. The glue was old and brittle. With a dry crackle, the lining gave way. Underneath the plush wasn't the rough grain of plywood. It was a sheet of dull, gray metal. Lead. Shielding? He whispered to himself. But why shield a case? He kept peeling. The lead sheet covered the entire bottom of the case. But it wasn't just a lining. It was a false bottom. The case was 3 inches deeper on the outside than it was on the inside. He grabbed a flathead screwdriver and wedged it under the lead. Elias stared. Beneath the false bottom, packed tightly into the cavity of the case structure, were not drugs and not cash. They were wires. Thousands of them. Copper coils, strange vacuum tubes flattened to fit the space, and a series of thin, translucent strings that looked like fishing line but shimmered with an iridescent oil slick hue. And sitting in the center of this technological nest was a small, leather-bound notebook. Elias spun around, dropping the screwdriver. His heart leaped into his throat. He had locked the deadbolt. He was sure of it. The heavy steel door swung open slowly. Standing in the frame, backlit by the hallway lights, was a man. Elias, Vane said, his voice smooth, like bow resin on a gut string. Working late. I admire that kind of dedication. Elias instinctively stepped between Vane and the workbench, blocking the view of the dissected case and the exposed guitar. The shop is closed, Julian. And the door was locked. Vane smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Locks are for honest men, Elias. You and I, we are artists. We transcend such barriers. Vane stepped into the shop. He moved with a predator's grace, his eyes scanning the room, touching everything but resting on nothing. I came to collect. It's the 1st of the month. I have until Friday, Elias said, his hands curling into fists. That was the deal. Friday. The deal changes when the wind changes, Vane said. He walked over to a rack of acoustics, running a gloved finger along the neck of a Martin D28. And the wind is blowing cold tonight. I hear rumors, Elias. Rumors of a clean-out at the penthouse. Elias felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. Vane knew. How did he always know? I don't know what you're talking about. I've been here all night, resetting a neck on a Gibson SG. Vane turned, his gaze locking onto Elias. You're a terrible liar. It's part of your charm, but it's also why you're in debt to me for $50,000. Vane took a step closer. He was close enough now that Elias could smell his cologne. Sandalwood and steel. Step aside, Elias. Get out of my shop. Vane chuckled. Or what? You'll hit me with a fret file. Vane moved to push past him. Elias shoved back. It was a mistake. Vane's hand moved faster than Elias could track. He gripped Elias's wrist, the one with the bad carpal tunnel, and twisted. Elias gasped, his knees buckling as pain shot up his arm. Vane slammed him back against the wall, pinning him there with effortless strength. I own this shop, Vane whispered, his face inches from Elias's. I own the tools. I own the wood. Vane released him and turned to the workbench. Elias clutched his wrist, breathing hard. He watched as Vane looked at the guitar. A 59 standard, Vane said, his voice dropping to a reverent hush. He picked up the guitar, inspecting the headstock. He set the guitar down gently, almost fearfully. Then he looked at the case. He saw the peeled-back lining. He saw the lead shielding. He saw the nest of wires and the strange strings. Vane's expression shifted. The arrogance vanished, replaced by something Elias had never seen on the man's face. Recognition and fear. You opened it, Vane said softly. I just found it, Elias stammered. I didn't know. Vane turned to him, his eyes wide. You fool. You have no idea what you've brought into this room. Vane reached into the case and snatched the leather-bound notebook. He shoved it into his suit pocket. Hey! Elias stepped forward. That's mine. This. Vane patted his pocket. This is a death warrant. And that. He pointed to the strange, iridescent strings coiled in the false bottom. Vane buttoned his jacket. He looked rattled. He looked at the door, then back at Elias. Listen to me carefully, Elias. Close the case. Glue the lining back. Take the guitar, put it in a gig bag, and burn that case. Burn it to ash. Do not sell it. Do not play those strings. Do not talk to anyone. Why? Vane turned and walked out of the shop, moving much faster than he had entered. The heavy door swung shut, leaving Elias alone in the buzzing silence. Elias stood there for a long minute, nursing his wrist. He looked at the case. Vane had taken the notebook, but he had left the strings. He had left the machine. Burn it, Vane had said. Elias looked at the iridescent strings. They seemed to hum, vibrating without being touched, resonating with a frequency that he felt in his teeth rather than heard with his ears. He didn't burn it. With trembling fingers, Elias began to unwind the low E string from the Les Paul's tuning peg. He pulled the old steel wire off and threaded the strange, iridescent string through the bridge. He pulled it up the neck, through the nut, and into the tuner. He tightened it. The string didn't just tighten. It seemed to grip the air. Elias plugged the guitar into his test amp, a small Fender Princeton in the corner. He flipped the standby switch. The tubes warmed up, glowing orange. He turned the volume to 3. He picked up a plectrum. He struck the low E. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical force. The note didn't decay. It bloomed, and in the corner of the room, where the shadows gathered thickest, the air began to ripple. Elias muted the string with his palm. The rippling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. He stared at the guitar. He stared at the case. He grabbed his phone and dialed Sarah again. Elias? She answered, her voice groggy. It's been 10 minutes. Don't go to sleep, Elias whispered, his eyes fixed on the corner of the room where the air had twisted. I'm coming over. And Sarah, bring your Geiger counter. My what? I think I found out why the case was so heavy, Elias said, unplugging the guitar. It wasn't shielding the guitar from the world. It was shielding the world from the guitar. He shoved the Les Paul, now strung with the single alien string, into a soft gig bag on his back. The workshop smelled of dragon's blood resin, oxidized brass, and the peculiar, dry sweetness of old spruce. It was a scent Elias Thorne usually found comforting, a sensory blanket that separated his sanctuary from the chaotic, rain-slicked streets of lower Manhattan. Elias stood over the workbench, the singular pool of light from his articulated desk lamp illuminating the object that had upended his evening. The violin case. It was an ugly thing, historically speaking, while the instrument inside, the Gibson Stradivarius, was a masterpiece of 18th-century Cremonese craftsmanship. The case was a clumsy, over-engineered sarcophagus from the late Victorian era. It was wrapped in battered alligator skin, the edges reinforced with tarnished silver. "You're hiding something?" Elias whispered, his voice cracking in the silence of the shop. He wasn't speaking to the violin. He had already examined the instrument, noting the discordant hum it produced, the wolf tone that shouldn't exist in a Strad. No, the weight was wrong. Not the violin's weight, the case. When he had lifted it onto the bench, it had listed to the left, a subtle imbalance that a layman would miss. He reached for a set of calipers and a thin, flexible probe he typically used for inspecting soundposts. Outside, thunder rattled the single-paned window, momentarily drowning out the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Elias ran his fingertips along the interior lining. It was crushed velvet, once a regal purple, now faded to the color of a bruise. He pressed along the perimeter of the accessory compartment. Solid. He moved to the neck block. Solid. There. A subtle give. A sponginess that wasn't just aged padding. Elias leaned in, adjusting his loop. The velvet seam along the bottom edge was almost invisible, sewn with a thread that matched the fabric perfectly. But the wear pattern was inconsistent. The velvet was worn smooth in the center, but near the edge, the pile was undisturbed, suggesting it didn't sit flush against the wood of the case. He picked up a scalpel. He hesitated. To cut into an antique case was a sin in his profession, a degradation of history. But the imbalance gnawed at him. The discordant note from the violin wasn't just acoustic. It was spiritual. The instrument felt haunted, and the ghost was in the box. With a surgical precision, Elias slid the blade under the velvet seam. The thread snapped with a sound like a breaking violin string. He peeled back the fabric. Underneath lay a panel of false wood, a thin veneer of mahogany that didn't match the oak structure of the outer shell. In the corner of the veneer, flush with the surface, was a tiny pinhole. "Clever," Elias muttered. He took his sound post setter, a thin steel tool, and inserted the tip into the pinhole. He applied pressure. Click. The sound was loud, mechanical, and satisfying. His heart hammered against his ribs. He set the tool down and hooked his fingernails under the mahogany panel, lifting it slowly. The smell hit him instantly. Not the sweet smell of spruce, but the acrid, chemical tang of decaying paper and iron gall ink. The compartment was shallow, no more than half an inch deep. Inside, resting on a bed of raw wool, were two distinct items. The first was a stack of papers bound in a wax paper band. They were thick, ornate, and bordered with intricate geometric lathe work. Elias carefully slid one out. "Jesus," he breathed. "Bearer bonds. Issued by the U.S. Treasury, dated 1924. He quickly thumbed the corners. $10,000 each. There were 20 of them. $200,000, but Elias was a historian before he was a capitalist. His eyes were drawn to the second item. It was a single envelope, sealed with a blob of red wax that had cracked down the middle. Elias picked it up. The paper felt like dried skin. He didn't need a letter opener. The adhesive had long since given up the ghost. He slid the folded letter out. The handwriting inside was worse than on the envelope, spiked with adrenaline. The ink blotched where the pen had rested too long, as if the writer had been pausing to listen for footsteps. He began to read. "October 14th, 1924, my dearest brother. If you are reading this, the varnish has dried, and I am dead. Do not grieve. The choices were mine and the debt is paid. They told me the wood was sourced from the wreckage of the cathedral. They lied. The wood is not holy. It is cursed. We did not buy the Gibson Stradivarius, Silas. We stole it, not from a shop and not from a collection. We took it from him while he still drew breath. Vane was there. He held the lantern. He saw the blood seep into the purfling and said it would improve the tone. He is a monster, Silas. A butcher in a silk suit. These bonds are my share of the payoff, blood money from the syndicate to keep our mouths shut about the fire. Do not spend them. Do not cash them. They are the chain that binds us to the crime. I have hidden them here, beneath the instrument, because Vane cannot play. He lacks the soul for it. He will never look here. Keep the violin safe, or burn it, but never let the Vane family reclaim it. If they get the violin, they get the proof. And if they get the proof, they will erase the Gibson name from the earth. Forgive me, Arthur. Elias set the letter down. His hands were shaking. The workshop suddenly felt very cold. Arthur Gibson, the great-uncle of the woman who had sold him the violin yesterday. The family lore was that Arthur had died of consumption in a sanatorium upstate. This letter suggested a far more violent exit. And the name, Vane. The bell above the shop door jangled, a harsh metallic intrusion that made Elias jump, knocking the scalpel to the floor with a clatter. He swept the bonds and the letter back into the false bottom and slapped the mahogany panel down. It didn't latch, but the velvet covered it enough to pass a cursory glance. He threw a polishing cloth over the open case just as the door swung fully open. It wasn't a customer. It was Sarah Miller, docs to the few people she allowed inside her circle. She shook a dripping umbrella onto his entryway mat, her combat boots squeaking on the hardwood. She looked like a drowned rat in a trench coat, her short, jaggedly cut black hair plastered to her forehead. You realize it is a deluge out there, Thorne? She said, her voice raspy from too many cigarettes and too much time spent in dusty archives. I had to wade across Canal Street. Elias exhaled, the tension in his shoulders knotting tight. Lock the door, docs. Sarah paused, her hand on the wet umbrella. She looked at him, really looked at him, with eyes that were sharp, intelligent, and deeply cynical. She saw the pallor of his skin, the slight tremor. She turned the deadbolt and flipped the sign to closed. Okay, she said, walking toward him, shedding her wet coat onto a customer's chair. You look like you've seen a murder, or you broke the Strad. Please tell me you didn't break the Strad. Worse, Elias said. He lifted the cloth. He pulled back the velvet. He handed her the letter. Sarah took it. She didn't ask questions. She was a researcher. She read. Her eyes darted back and forth across the page, narrowing with every line. When she finished, she looked at the bonds, then back at Elias. His grandfather probably, Elias said. Or great-grandfather. Julian Vane acts as a patron for the Philharmonic, Sarah said, her mind working rapidly, connecting dots. He sits on the board of the Met. He owns half the real estate in Tribeca. And apparently, Sarah picked up one of the bonds, holding it up to the light. These are bearer bonds, Elias. Whoever holds them owns them. There's no registration. If Vane finds out you have these, he kills me, Elias finished, just like they probably killed Arthur. No, Sarah corrected, her voice dropping to a whisper. He doesn't just kill you. He destroys your reputation first. He burns your shop. She dropped the bond back into the case as if it were radioactive. Why did you call me? You should have called the police. The police? Elias laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Julian Vane has dinner with the police commissioner twice a month. Who do you think they'd believe? The billionaire philanthropist or the luthier with a dusty shop and a mysterious stack of cash? Fair point, Sarah conceded. She leaned against the workbench, staring at the violin. So the discordant note, the wolf tone, it wasn't the sound post. It was the physics of the case. The hollow space beneath the block was acting as a secondary resonance chamber. absorbing the frequencies. Docs, Elias said. I don't care about the acoustics right now. You should, she snapped. Because that's the only reason Vane hasn't kicked your door down yet. He doesn't know the bonds are in there. If the Vane family has been hunting this violin for a century, they want the instrument. They probably think the proof was destroyed ages ago. They want the trophy. So what do? Clang. The shop bell rang again. Elias froze. Sarah's eyes went wide. They both looked at the door. The deadbolt was thrown. The sign said closed. But through the rain-streaked glass, a silhouette stood under the street lamp. The figure didn't knock. He simply stood there, a dark shape against the gray torrent, staring through the glass. He wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, the water cascading off the brim. Is that him? Sarah whispered. I've never met him in person, Elias hissed. Only seen photos in the society pages. The figure raised a hand. He didn't pound on the door. He tapped on the glass with a single ring-clad finger. Top. Elias moved to cover the case again, but Sarah grabbed his wrist. Don't, she breathed. If you hide it now, you look guilty. Act like you're working. Just a late night. He sees us, Elias said. Then let him in, Sarah said, her face setting into a mask of professional boredom. If we don't, he'll know we're scared. Vane is a predator, Elias. You don't run from predators. You stand your ground and look big. Elias swallowed the bile rising in his throat. He walked to the door. His hand hovered over the deadbolt. He could feel the cold radiating from the glass. He turned the lock. The door opened with a gust of wind and rain. Julian Vane stepped inside. He was older than he looked in the papers, his face a map of refined cruelty. High cheekbones, silver hair swept back, eyes the color of polished slate. He was dry, somehow, despite the storm, as if the rain had respectfully declined to touch him. Mr. Thorne, Vane said. His voice was a baritone purr, smooth as oil. My apologies for the late hour. The weather is positively biblical. Isn't it? Elias didn't offer a hand. We're closed, Mr. Vane. Vane smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. You know who I am. Excellent. That saves time. He stepped further into the shop, his eyes immediately scanning the room, ignoring Sarah completely. His gaze landed on the workbench. On the open case, Elias stepped sideways, blocking the line of sight to the interior of the case. I'm in the middle of a delicate restoration, Elias said. The Gibson Stradivarius, Vane said, taking another step. I heard a rumor it had surfaced. I'm a collector, as you know. I have a sentimental attachment to that particular period of Cremonese history. It's not for sale, Elias said. I'm just appraising it for the owner. Everything is for sale, Mr. Thorne. It's merely a question of currency. Vane stopped 3 feet from Elias. He smelled of expensive cologne and ozone. I am prepared to offer double the market value. In cash. Tonight. I can't sell what isn't mine. Vane's smile tightened at the edges. A man of principle. How rare. He finally looked at Sarah. And you must be the archivist. Ms. Miller. Sarah didn't blink. And I've read about your family's contributions to the arts, Mr. Vane. Fascinating how many museums have wings named after you, considering where the money came from. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Vane turned his head slowly back to Elias. The veneer of politeness was thinning, revealing the steel beneath. The Gibson has a flaw, Vane said softly. A defect. It has always been a troublesome instrument. It brings bad luck to those who hold it too long. You should be, Vane said. He reached into his coat pocket. Elias tensed, expecting a weapon. Vane pulled out a business card. It was black with gold embossing. He placed it gently on a nearby display case. I will give you 24 hours to facilitate the sale with the current owner. If you find the task too difficult, well, my associates are very persuasive negotiators. Vane looked past Elias, toward the violin case. For a second, Elias thought he saw a flicker of hunger in the man's eyes. Not for the wood, but for the secret it held. "Take care, Mr. Thorne," Vane said. "Old wood is so flammable." He tipped his hat, turned on his heel, and walked back out into the storm. The door clicked shut behind him. Elias locked it instantly. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the door, exhaling a breath he felt he'd been holding for 5 minutes. "He knows," Elias said. "He suspects," Sarah corrected, her voice shaky now that the threat was gone. "If he knew, we'd be dead." Elias turned back to the workbench. The violin lay there, beautiful and terrible. "He offered double," Elias said. "He wants it bad." "He wants the letter," Sarah said. She walked over and picked up the scalpel Elias had dropped. She held it up to the light. "Arthur Gibson wrote that Vane's grandfather was a butcher." Elias looked at the bonds. $200,000 in 1924. Millions now. Enough to disappear. Enough to start over. Or enough to get them killed. "We have to move it," Elias said. "He'll come back." "Where?" Sarah asked. "My apartment is a shoebox. Your place is the first place they'll look." Elias looked at the violin, then at the case. He realized then that the puzzle wasn't solved. Opening the latch was just the beginning. He reached into the false bottom and grabbed the stack of bonds and the letter. He shoved them into the inner pocket of his leather apron. "Docs, I need you to find everything you can on the fire Arthur mentioned. The one in 1924. If we can prove the Vane family was involved, this letter goes from being a story to being evidence." "And you?" Sarah asked. Elias picked up the violin. He plucked the G-string. The note rang out, deep and mournful, but the rattle was gone. The case had been the problem. The secret had been the mute. "I'm going to finish the appraisal," Elias said, his eyes hard. "And then I'm going to find out why a violin is worth killing for. If Vane wants a war, I'll give him one. But he's not getting this instrument." "Yeah. Don't die. You still owe me for the after-hours consult." Elias watched her go, then turned back to the empty, open case. The velvet lining looked like a gaping maw. He reached for his glue pot. He had to seal the false bottom back up. He had to make it look untouched. The deception had begun with the Gibson family. But tonight, Elias Thorne was sewing himself into the legacy. He applied the hot hide glue, the smell masking the scent of old fear, and pressed the velvet back into place. Outside, the thunder cracked, sounding less like nature and more like a gavel coming down. The trial had started. The rain in lower Manhattan didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker, turning the cobblestones of the meatpacking district into a treacherous, glistening mosaic of oil and old water. Elias Thorne adjusted the collar of his coat, the damp wool scratching against his neck. Under his left arm, pressed tight against his ribs like a spare heart, sat a leather portfolio. Inside, Chapter 3 was not about music. It was about silence, and the terrifying noise that fills it when you know you are walking into a trap of your own making. Elias checked his watch. 2:14 p.m. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unspent thunder. He was 20 minutes late for a meeting he wasn't sure he should be having, but the questions burning a hole in his mind left him no choice. He ducked under the awning of a fading bodega, shaking the water from his hair, and glanced across the street. There it was, the Rusty Fret. It wasn't a pawn shop, not technically. It was a dive bar that smelled of sawdust and regret, the kind of place where musicians went to pawn their souls when the instruments were already gone. But in the back, past the bathrooms that smelled of chlorine and ammonia, Sarah Doc, Elias pushed through the heavy oak door. The air inside was dry and stale, a stark contrast to the humidity of the street. It was early, the lunchtime crowd long gone, the happy hour crowd hours away. The jukebox was silent. Sarah was in the back booth, a pool of shadow in an otherwise dim room. She didn't look up as he approached. She was busy dissecting a chaotic plate of nachos with the precision of a surgeon, her eyes fixed on a battered tablet propped up against a napkin holder. "You're wet, Elias," she said, her voice a gravelly contralto that hinted at a lifetime of cigarettes and shouting over drum solos. "It's raining, Sarah." It's always raining when you bring me trouble. She finally looked up. Her glasses were thick, magnifying eyes that were too sharp, too intelligent for a bar this dark. Sarah Miller was a legend in the underground antiquities circuit, a woman who could spot a forged signature on a contract from across the room. Seat. Elias slid into the booth. The leather squeaked, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet bar. He didn't order a drink. He placed the portfolio on the sticky table. "I need you to look at something," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Sarah wiped her hands on a napkin, her expression shifting from bored to wary. "You told me on the phone you found a guitar. I don't appraise guitars, Elias. I appraise provenance. Paper, ink, history." "It's not the guitar," Elias said. He unzipped the portfolio. He didn't take the bond out. He just opened the leather flap enough to reveal the corner of the intricate galoche patterning. "It's what was inside the case." Sarah leaned in. The apathy vanished instantly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a jeweler's loupe, screwing it into her eye socket with practiced ease. She didn't touch the paper. She hovered over it, inhaling sharply. "Treasury bond," she murmured. "Series 1936. Bearer bond. Is it real?" Sarah looked up, the loupe making one eye look monstrously large. "Real? Elias, the paper is right. The ink has the right oxidation. But look at the denomination." Elias had looked at it 1,000 times in the last 24 hours. $100,000. "High denomination," Elias said.
Impossible dénomination, Sarah corrected.
She sat back, the loupe popping out into her hand. "The Treasury printed high-value notes for interbank transfers. Sure, but these... The 36 series didn't look like this. The engraving style is... off. It's too good. It's better than the government's work. So it's a fake." Elias felt a strange mixture of disappointment and relief. If it was fake, he could burn it. He could go back to playing session gigs and forgetting his grandfather ever existed. "I didn't say that." Sarah's voice dropped even lower. She looked around the empty bar. "I said it's too good. This is what we call a ghost note in the trade. It has the watermark of the Federal Reserve, but the serial number." She tapped the plastic covering of the portfolio. "That serial number corresponds to a batch of unissued debt from the post-depression recovery plan. Money that was supposed to be destroyed." Supposed to be? Someone kept it. Or someone stole it. Sarah pushed the portfolio back toward him. "How many do you have?" Elias hesitated. The lie tasted like copper on his tongue. "Just the one." Sarah stared at him. She knew he was lying. "If you try to cash this at a bank, the Secret Service will have you in a windowless room before you can finish your coffee. If you try to sell it to a collector, word gets out. And people who trade in ghost notes don't sue when a deal goes bad, Elias. They erase the problem. I need to know its value, Sarah. The real value, not the face value. Street value." Sarah laughed, a dry, hacking sound. 10 cents on the dollar, maybe, if you find a buyer with a death wish. But you can't authenticate it here. Where do I go?" Sarah hesitated. She looked at Elias with something approaching pity. "There's a place in Chinatown. A pawnbroker named Kozlov. He runs a shop called Empire Loans. He has a machine, an old spectral scanner from the 80s. He can check the magnetic signature of the ink without pinging the Fed's database. But Elias, Kozlov is a bottom feeder. He feeds information up the chain. You walk in there, you're ringing a dinner bell. I just need to know if it's real," Elias said, zipping the portfolio shut. "If it's real, I have leverage. If it's fake, I have kindling." "If it's real," Sarah whispered, "you have a target on your back." The subway ride to Canal Street was a blur of screeching metal and flickering lights. Elias felt the vibration of the train in his teeth. He kept his hand over the inside pocket of his coat, feeling the stiff rectangle of the portfolio. Leverage. That was the word he clung to. His grandfather hadn't just left him a guitar. He had left him a key. But a key to what? Chinatown was breathing its own distinct atmosphere. Steamed buns, wet asphalt, and the metallic tang of fish markets. Empire Loans was a hole in the wall, sandwiched between a herbalist shop displaying dried seahorses and a storefront selling knockoff luggage. The windows were barred, the glass so thick with grime it was opaque. A neon sign buzzed erratically. Loans Gold Watches. The O in Loans. Elias pushed the buzzer. A beat of silence, then a heavy clack as the magnetic lock disengaged. He stepped inside. The sensory assault was immediate. The shop smelled of old dust, stale tobacco, and ozone. Every inch of wall space was covered. Guitars hung by their necks like executed prisoners. Behind a wall of bulletproof plexiglass sat Kozlov. He was a mountain of a man, seemingly melting into his chair. His skin was the color of rising dough, his eyes small and dark, buried in folds of flesh. "We close in 10, Kozlov grunted, not looking up from a portable TV playing a soap opera. "I'm not here to sell," Elias said, approaching the glass. The slot at the bottom was a narrow mouth. "I need an authentication." Kozlov paused mid-chew. He looked up, his eyes scanning Elias from boots to haircut. "I ain't an appraiser, kid. Go to Sotheby's. They don't have a spectral scanner for 1930s magnetic ink," Elias said, repeating the words Sarah had fed him. The air in the shop changed. The boredom evaporated from Kozlov's face, replaced by a sharp, predatory stillness. He spat a shell into the cup. "What you got?" Elias pulled the bond from the portfolio. He didn't slide it through. He held it up to the glass. Kozlov squinted. He leaned forward, his massive bulk shifting, the chair groaning in protest. He pressed a button, and the overhead lights dimmed. "Slide it," Kozlov commanded. "No," Elias said. "You scan it from there. I hold it." Kozlov chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "Paranoid. Good. Paranoid lives longer. Put it on the tray." There was a sliding metal tray, like at a bank. Elias placed the bond on it but kept his fingertips on the edge of the paper. Kozlov manipulated a device on a swinging arm, a bulky, beige piece of machinery that looked like it belonged in a Cold War bunker. A red laser line swept across the bond, illuminating the intricate scrollwork. Elias held his breath. The machine whirred, then emitted a series of rapid clicks. "Paper is right," Kozlov muttered, his eyes darting to a monitor that Elias couldn't see. "Rag content matches. Is it valid?" Elias asked. Kozlov didn't answer immediately. He was typing something into a keyboard, his thick fingers moving with surprising speed. The serial number, K974. Suddenly, the whirring of the machine stopped. A soft, digital ping. Kozlov's face went blank. Too blank. The predatory interest was gone, replaced by a mask of professional indifference that was far more terrifying. "It's a good forgery," Kozlov lied. Elias felt the hairs on his arms stand up. He was a musician. He knew when a rhythm was broken. The ping hadn't been an error message. It had been a confirmation. And Kozlov's heart rate, Elias could almost hear it accelerating, didn't match his bored tone. "Give it back," Elias said. "Hold on," Kozlov said, his hand drifting below the counter. "I want to check the watermark again, just to be sure." "I said give it back." Elias snatched the bond from the tray just as Kozlov slammed a button. Metal shutters began to descend over the front door and windows with a roar like a crashing wave. Clang, clang, clang. "You don't want to leave yet," Kozlov said, his voice dropping an octave. He stood up, and for the first time, Elias saw the gun holstered under his armpit. "My friends, they pay a lot for good forgeries. Sit down." Elias didn't sit. He scrambled backward, shoving the bond into his coat pocket. The front door was sealed. A steel curtain blocked the exit. The shop was a cage. "Open the door," Elias shouted. "Protocol," Kozlov said calmly, sitting back down. "System locks down when it detects Class A illicit material. Police are on the way. Or someone else. Depends on who gets the signal first." Elias looked around frantically. The walls were lined with junk. Heavy junk. He grabbed a vintage Fender Stratocaster, a 1970s model heavy ash wood, from the wall. It was a sacrilege, but he didn't care. "Don't do it, kid," Kozlov warned, reaching for his intercom. Elias swung. He didn't aim for the bulletproof glass. That was suicide. He aimed for the fire sprinkler head protruding from the low ceiling above the counter. The headstock of the guitar smashed into the valve. Crack. The water didn't trickle. It exploded. A torrent of black, stagnant sludge that had been sitting in the pipes for decades blasted downward, drenching the booth, the electronics, and Kozlov. Sparks flew as the water hit the spectral scanner and the computer. The monitor fizzled and died. The magnetic lock on the front door, shorting out from the electrical surge in the booth, began to click erratically. Click-clack, click-clack. Kozlov roared, blinded by the oily water, firing a shot blindly into the ceiling. Elias dropped the guitar and threw his shoulder against the steel shutter. It was jammed, but the electronic lock was spasming. He kicked the control panel by the door. The shutter groaned and rose a foot. He dropped to the floor and rolled. The wet pavement outside slapped his face. He scrambled up, gasping for air, and sprinted into the crowd of Canal Street. He didn't look back. He just ran, weaving through tourists and hawkers, clutching his coat, his heart hammering a frantic, dissonant beat against his ribs. High above the city, in a penthouse that looked down upon the clouds, the air was perfectly conditioned, scented with white tea and cedar. Julian Vane stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the storm move out over the Atlantic. He was a man of sharp angles and bespoke tailoring, holding a crystal tumbler of sparkling water. His phone, resting on a marble plinth, vibrated once. A single, distinct pulse. Julian walked over and picked it up. The screen displayed a map of Chinatown, a red dot pulsing at a specific intersection. Below it was a stream of data. Spectral match. Series 1936. Serial K. 974. A ghost from the past had just walked into a pawn shop. Julian smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the expression of a chess master who sees the board open up. "So," he whispered to the empty room, "the Gibson legacy isn't a myth." He tapped an icon on the screen. The call connected instantly. "Mr. Vane," a voice answered. Rough, efficient. "We have a hit on the spectral net," Julian said smoothly. "Empire Loans. The proprietor, Mr. Kozlov, likely failed to contain the asset. He is clumsy. Instructions. Secure the footage from the shop. Identify the carrier. And burn the shop." "Burn it, sir? We can't have loose ends, can we? If the bond has surfaced, the game has begun. I want the carrier found. Tonight." Julian hung up. He looked back out at the city. The lights were flickering on as the evening deepened, millions of tiny sparks in the darkness. Somewhere down there, a man was running with a piece of history in his pocket. A piece of history that belonged to Julian Vane by blood and by right. He took a sip of water. It was crisp and cold. "Run, rabbit," Julian murmured. "Run." Elias didn't stop running until he hit the East Village. His lungs were burning, his clothes soaked with rain and sweat. He ducked into a subway station, the roar of the incoming train masking the sound of his own ragged breathing. He leaned against the tiled wall, sliding down until he was crouching. He pulled the bond out. It was dry. The leather portfolio had done its job. He looked at the intricate engraving of the eagle, the stoic face of a forgotten founding father. It wasn't just money. It was a beacon. He had turned it on, and now they were coming. He remembered Sarah's words. "You have a target on your back." Elias Thorne closed his eyes. The melody in his head was no longer a ballad. It was a dirge. But as the train screeched into the station, he realized something else. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He knew the bond was real. He knew they wanted it. And for the first time in his life, Elias Thorne held the only thing that mattered. He boarded the train, disappearing into the mass of bodies, a single note in a deafening symphony, waiting for the next movement to begin. The air in the basement of Miller's Antiquities tasted of dry rot, ozone, and the peculiar, sweet decay of old paper. It was a scent Elias Thorne had grown up with in his father's luthier shop, usually accompanied by the smell of sawdust and hide glue. Here, however, beneath the bustling pavement of Greenwich Village, the smell was sharper, laced with the metallic tang of fear. Elias sat on a stool that wobbled slightly on the uneven concrete floor. In his hands, the neck of the Gibson J200 felt like a live wire. The guitar, a sunburst beauty from 1952, had been surgically opened an hour ago. Its secrets, hidden for 70 years behind the rosewood bridge plate, were now spread across a stainless steel table under the harsh glare of a halogen lamp. Sarah Dox Miller adjusted her spectacles, the lenses reflecting the fragmented documents. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper intellect, her fingers encased in white cotton gloves, as she maneuvered a pair of tweezers with the precision of a bomb disposal technician. "You realize what this is, Elias?" Sarah asked, her voice low, barely rising above the hum of the dehumidifier in the corner. "We aren't looking at a love letter. We aren't looking at a song sheet." Elias leaned forward, his eyes tracing the faded blue ink on the yellowed parchment. "It looks like a ledger, or a manifesto." "It's an insurance policy," Sarah corrected. She carefully unfolded a brittle corner of the paper. "And it's written in blood, metaphorically, and—" She hovered the magnifying glass over a rusted brown smear on the margin. "Quite literally, the events of the last 48 hours, the discordant note that rattled the guitar's body, the frantic escape from the pawn shop, the shadow of Julian Vane dogging his steps, felt like a fever dream." Elias was a man who fixed broken instruments. He tuned strings to perfect pitch. He did not traffic in bearer bonds or cold cases. Yet, the ghost of 1954 was currently sitting on the table, demanding to be heard. "Read the date," Sarah commanded. "October 14th, 1954, Elias read. "The day of the Van Doren heist," Sarah said, dropping the tweezers with a metallic clatter. She looked up, her eyes wide behind the glass. "My God, Elias, this isn't just a stolen guitar. This is the missing link to the single largest unrecovered bond theft in New York history." 3 miles uptown, the atmosphere was sterile, cold, and expensive. Julian Vane stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of a penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city was a grid of bioluminescent veins, traffic pulsing through the arteries of Manhattan. Vane did not care for the view. He cared for the silence. He wore a suit that cost more than Elias Thorne's entire shop, tailored to conceal the Glock 19 nestled against his ribs. Vane was a cleaner, a fixer, a ghost story told in the boardrooms of shadow corporations. He was the man you called when the past refused to stay buried. "The pawn shop protocol was messy, Julian," a voice rasped on the other end. It was synthetic, distorted by layers of encryption. "Unavoidable," Vane replied, his voice a smooth baritone, devoid of emotion. The luthier Thorne panicked. "He has the instrument, and he has the girl. Miller, the archivist. She's troublesome, resourceful." Vane turned away from the window, his reflection lingering on the glass like a specter. "But they are static. They are looking backward. I am looking for the bonds, Julian. If those serial numbers see the light of day, the foundation crumbles. The names on those certificates, they are the grandfathers of senators, of kings." "I know the stakes," Vane said, walking toward a laptop open on a glass desk. On the screen, a digital map pulsed with a tracking beacon. It was faint, intermittent, bouncing off cell towers in the village. The hitman failed in 54. He grew a conscience. "Finish it. Tonight." The line went dead. Vane stared at the screen. He picked up a pair of black leather gloves, pulling them on slowly, stretching the leather over his knuckles. He didn't hate Elias Thorne. He didn't even know him. Back in the archives, the air felt heavier, as if the weight of the history they were unearthing was displacing the oxygen. Sarah had pinned the documents under a sheet of plexiglass. She was cross-referencing names on a tablet, her fingers flying across the screen. "Okay, here's the narrative," Sarah said, her voice picking up speed. 1954. The Van Doren Trust moves $12 million in bearer bonds from a private vault in the Chrysalis building to a secure train headed for Chicago. They never make it to the station. I know the story, Elias murmured, running a hand through his messy hair. The driver was found shot. The guards were drugged. The bonds vanished into thin air. Not thin air. Sarah tapped the Gibson's hollow body. Maple and spruce. The police thought it was the mob. The mob thought it was a rogue element. But this, she pointed to the handwriting on the note. This was written by the man who took them. A man named Silas. No last name. Elias looked at the script. It was jagged, frantic. Asterisk, the job is done, but the price is too high. Cannot kill him. He is the only one who knows the music. I have hidden the fire inside the wood. If you are reading this, I am dead, and the debt is unpaid. Asterisk. Who was he supposed to kill? Elias asked. Sarah swiped the screen of her tablet, bringing up an old, grainy black and white photograph. It showed a jazz quartet in a smoky club. In the center, holding the very Gibson J200 that lay on the table, was a man with a haunted expression and a jawline that Elias recognized instantly. My grandfather, Elias whispered. The room seemed to tilt. Marcus Thorne. Silas was the hitman, Sarah explained, her voice softening. He was hired by the Van Doren family, or the people stealing from them, to eliminate the witnesses. Your grandfather was the courier, Elias. He wasn't just a musician. He was moving the package. Elias felt a wave of nausea. The stories of his grandfather were of a gentle man, a luthier who loved the blues, not a bagman for a multimillion-dollar heist. He was a criminal? He was a mule, probably coerced, Sarah said. But Silas was the professional. He was supposed to execute Marcus and take the bonds. Instead, look, she pointed to the letter again. Asterisk, I cannot kill him. He is the only one who knows the music. Asterisk. They were friends, Elias realized. Or at least Silas respected him. Silas hid the bonds inside Marcus's guitar, Sarah deduced. He sealed them behind the bridge plate, knowing Marcus would never sell the instrument. It was a vault that only a luthier could open without destroying the contents. Silas took the heat, probably took a bullet, and left the fortune in the hands of the man he was sent to kill. Elias looked at the guitar with new eyes. It wasn't just an heirloom. It was a coffin, a testament to a moment of mercy in a brutal world. But here's the kicker, Sarah said, her face grim. The bonds aren't just money. I ran the serial numbers through the dark web archives. These bonds were leverage. They were bribes paid to politicians, judges, police chiefs in the 50s. The Van Doren family didn't want the money back. They wanted the evidence destroyed. And the people who want it now? The descendants of those politicians. The legacy of that corruption, Sarah said. That's who Julian Vane works for. He's not here for the cash, Elias. He's here to erase the history. A sudden, sharp ping from Sarah's laptop shattered the conversation. A red warning window popped up on her security feed. Motion sensor, Sarah hissed, killing the overhead light instantly. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the pale blue glow of the computer monitors. Where? Elias whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Rear alley. The fire escape. Sarah was already moving, grabbing a hard drive and sweeping the documents from under the plexiglass. He's found us. Elias grabbed the Gibson. He couldn't leave it. It was the evidence, the shield, and the target all at once. He felt the vibration of the wood against his chest. How did he find us? He didn't track us, Sarah said, shoving the papers into a waterproof canister. He tracked the resonance. What? The pawn shop. When you played the chord to open the secret compartment. Vane had audio surveillance. He analyzed the frequency. He's been scanning the city for that specific harmonic signature. We led him right to the door. Above them, the antique shop floorboards creaked. It was a subtle sound, the groan of old wood under shifting weight, but to Elias's trained ear, it was as loud as a gunshot. It wasn't the random settling of a building. It was the measured, rhythmic step of a predator. "Back exit," Sarah commanded, grabbing Elias's sleeve. Through the steam tunnels. They moved through the dark clutter of the basement, navigating a maze of book stacks and filing cabinets. Sarah reached a heavy iron door behind a shelf of rotting encyclopedias and spun the wheel. It groaned in protest. From the top of the stairs, a voice drifted down. It was calm, polite, and terrifying. "Mr. Thorne, Ms. Miller, there is no need for theatrics." Julian Vane stood at the top of the basement stairs, silhouetted against the streetlights filtering in from the shop windows above. He held a silenced pistol loosely at his side. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an accountant coming to collect a past-due bill. "The bonds have expired," Vane called out, taking a step down. The wood whined. "They are worthless paper. Give them to me and you walk away." Elias froze. The distance between them was less than 30 feet. He could see the gleam of Vane's eyes. Elias shoved the guitar onto his back, the strap digging into his shoulder, and threw his weight against the iron wheel. It screeched, metal grinding on metal. Vane raised the weapon. "Don't." The shot was a cough in the silence. A spark erupted from the iron doorframe, inches from Elias's head, sending a spray of hot metal into his cheek. He didn't flinch. Adrenaline had taken the wheel. With a primal grunt, he kicked the door. It swung inward, revealing a black maw of damp tunnel dark. "Go!" Elias shouted, shoving Sarah through. He turned back for a split second. Vane was moving faster now, descending the stairs with fluid grace, firing again. Elias dove into the tunnel and slammed the iron door shut. He spun the locking wheel just as a heavy thud shook the metal from the other side. Vane had reached the door. "He'll blow the hinges," Sarah panted, her flashlight beam cutting through the misty air of the steam tunnel. "We have 2 minutes, maybe less." "Where does this go?" Elias asked, his voice shaking. "Subway maintenance access. The A-line. We disappear into the noise." They ran. The tunnel was slick with slime and condensation, the air thick with the smell of rust and rat droppings. Elias clutched the neck of the Gibson, his mind reeling. The echo of 1954 was no longer a metaphor. As they sprinted, Elias's mind flashed back to the letter. *I cannot kill him. He is the only one who knows the music. Silas had spared his grandfather. He had chosen humanity over the job. But Julian Vane, Elias thought as he heard the muffled explosion of the door hinges behind them, has made no such choice. "Left!" Sarah shouted, veering into a side passage. They burst out onto a narrow catwalk overlooking a subway track. The roar of an approaching train filled the space, a deafening crescendo of steel and wind. The lights of the train grew brighter, illuminating the grime on the walls. "Are you insane?" To the maintenance platform across the tracks. Before the train hits, Elias looked at the gap. 10 feet over the electrified third rail. The train was seconds away. He looked back at the tunnel entrance. A silhouette appeared, calm and composed, raising a weapon. Vane had cleared the breach. Elias didn't think. He grabbed Sarah's hand, tightened his grip on the Gibson, and leaped. For a second, they were airborne, suspended in the space between life and death, the past and the future. They landed hard on the opposite grating, rolling to absorb the impact just as the subway train screamed past. A blur of silver and light, cutting off Vane's line of sight. The wind of the train whipped their hair, the screech of the wheels drowning out any gunshot. Elias lay on the cold grate, gasping for air, clutching the guitar to his chest. He looked at Sarah. She was pale, bleeding from a scrape on her forehead, but alive. The train passed, leaving a vacuum of silence in its wake. Elias looked across the tracks. The other platform was empty. Julian Vane was gone. "He's not gone," Sarah said, reading his mind. She struggled to her feet. "He's flanking. He knows the tunnels better than we do." Elias stood up, his legs trembling. He touched the body of the guitar. The bonds were still inside. The truth was still inside. "We need to find the recipient," Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady. "What?" "The letter." Silas said the debt was unpaid. He couldn't finish the job. "We have to finish it for him." Elias looked at Sarah, his eyes hardening. "We don't run anymore. We find out who ordered the hit. We find the head of the snake." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the steel in his voice. She nodded once. "The Van Doren estate. The heir is still alive. He's in the Hamptons." "Then we go to the Hamptons," Elias said, "and we play them a song they haven't heard in 70 years. He slung the Gibson back over his shoulder. The strings hummed against the wood, a resonant chord that sounded like a warning. The echoes of 1954 were getting louder, and Elias Thorne was finally ready to listen. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker, turning the cobblestones of Pioneer Square into treacherous, shining scales. Inside the luthier shop, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the deeper, ancient smell of Honduran mahogany and hide glue. It was a sanctuary of resonance, usually a place where broken things were made whole, but tonight, Elias Thorne felt like the fracture running through the center of the room. He stood over the workbench, his hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the 1954 Gibson Les Paul Goldtop. Under the harsh swing-arm lamp, the instrument looked less like a guitar and more like a relic of a lost civilization. The gold finish was checked and cracked, a spiderweb of age that collectors called patina, and Elias called survival. "Stop looking at it like it's going to bite you, Sarah Dox Miller said. She was perched on a stool near the back office door, the blue light of her laptop casting a ghostly pallor over her face. Her glasses were slid down the bridge of her nose, her eyes darting across lines of scanned text. "It's not the bite I'm worried about," Elias murmured, finally touching the cold nickel of the bridge. "It's the poison." The guitar was hollowed out not by design but by deception. Chapter 4 had revealed the cavity beneath the pickups, a masterful routing job done 60 years ago to conceal the microledger that now sat connected to Sarah's computer. The ledger contained the names, the payoffs, and the blood money that had built the Vane family empire. It was the discordant note that ruined the symphony of a legitimate business legacy. "I've got the decryption key running," Sarah said, her voice tight. "The cipher is based on musical notation. It's clever. It's Vane's father's handwriting. If we upload this to the cloud, Julian Vane is finished. The SEC, the FBI, Interpol. Take your pick." "And if Vane gets here first?" Elias asked, looking at the darkened front window. The neon sign of the pawn shop across the street buzzed intermittently, painting the wet pavement in strokes of violent red. "He doesn't know we're here," Sarah assured him, though her hand drifted unconsciously to the heavy brass paperweight on the desk. "We went dark. No cell phones. No credit cards." Elias picked up a chisel, testing the edge against his thumb. "Men like Julian Vane don't need GPS. They follow the money. And this," he tapped the gold top. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the tin roof. Then the sound changed. It wasn't a noise from outside, but a shift in the air pressure within the shop. The front door, which Elias had locked and bolted, didn't crash open. There was no explosion, no dramatic entrance. Instead, the bell above the door gave a singular, melancholy tink. Elias spun around, the chisel gripped like a dagger. The lock had been picked with surgical precision. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and expensive fabric. His charcoal suit absorbed the light, and his face was a mask of cultivated boredom, save for the eyes. They were predatory, shark black, and devoid of any warmth. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him to shut out the noise of the storm. "You have a lovely shop, Mr. Thorne," Vane said. His voice was smooth, a baritone that resonated in the chest. "A bit dusty for my taste, but there is an undeniable charm to manual labor." Sarah slammed her laptop shut, clutching it to her chest. Vane's eyes flicked to her, dismissing her instantly as a non-threat, before locking back onto Elias. "Get out," Elias said, though the command lacked the iron he wished it had. Vane walked forward, his leather shoes making no sound on the wooden floorboards. He stopped at a rack of acoustic guitars, running a gloved finger along the curve of a Martin D28. "I've always admired luthiers. You play God with wood and wire. You decide what sings and what remains silent." He turned, his gaze landing heavily on the workbench. "On the gold top. And you," Vane continued, walking toward the bench, "have been singing very loudly, Mr. Thorne, a song that doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people your father stole from," Elias said. "The unions he broke. The musicians he blackmailed." Vane sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. He reached into his jacket. Elias tensed, raising the chisel, but Vane only produced a silver cigarette case. He didn't light one. He just tapped the case against his palm in a slow, rhythmic beat. "My father was a visionary. He understood that art requires patronage, and patronage requires capital. The methods are irrelevant. Only the legacy remains." Vane stopped 3 feet from the workbench. "You have something of mine, the Gibson, and, I assume, the little history lesson hidden inside it." "It's over, Vane," Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling but defiant. "The data is already queued for upload. One keystroke and the world sees the rot inside your empire." Vane looked at her then, really looked at her with the cold curiosity of a child inspecting an insect. "Miss Miller, the archivist, you think information is power. It's a quaint notion. But in the real world, power is the ability to stop the information from ever maturing." He snapped his fingers. The back door of the shop, the heavy steel security door leading to the alley, buckled with a deafening clang. The hinges screamed, and the wood of the frame splintered inward. 2 men, built like retaining walls and dressed in tactical rain gear, squeezed into the room. They carried suppressed submachine guns, held low but ready. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He had expected a confrontation, perhaps a negotiation. He hadn't expected a hit squad. "Now," Vane said, the veneer of politeness thinning. "The laptop, the guitar, and the ledger." Elias looked at the gold top. It was beautiful, a masterpiece of 1954 craftsmanship. But it was also the anchor weighing them down. "If you kill us," Elias said, trying to keep his voice steady, "the upload triggers automatically. A dead man's switch." It was a bluff. Vane tilted his head, studying Elias's pulse in his neck. "A gamble. I like gambles, but I prefer sure things." Vane nodded to the men. "Secure the woman. Do not damage the computer." "No." Elias lunged. It was a foolish move born of desperation. He swung the chisel, aiming for Vane, but he was a craftsman, not a fighter. Vane sidestepped with fluid grace, catching Elias's wrist. With a sickening twist, Vane applied pressure to the radial nerve. Elias gasped, his hand going numb, the chisel clattering to the floor. Vane shoved him back, hard. Elias stumbled, crashing into a shelf of varnish cans. Glass shattered, and the pungent smell of turpentine flooded the room, mixing with the metallic scent of fear. "Messy," Vane tooted, wiping his glove with a handkerchief. "I hate messy." One of the mercenaries grabbed Sarah. She kicked and screamed, driving her heel into the man's instep, but he didn't even flinch. He wrenched the laptop from her hands and shoved her toward the wall. "Check it," Vane ordered. The mercenary opened the laptop. "Encrypted, sir, but the upload is paused. No internet connection." Vane smiled, a thin, cruel curving of lips. "You see, Mr. Thorne? The storm knocked out the local nodes 10 minutes ago. Providence favors the prepared." He walked to the workbench and picked up the gold top. He held it with reverence, admiring the arch of the top. "My father bought this the day I was born. He said it was the only thing in the world that never lied." "Pureton." Vane looked at the open cavity, the exposed wires. "A pity you gutted it." Elias pulled himself up from the turpentine-soaked floor. His wrist was throbbing, but his mind was racing. He needed a weapon. He needed a distraction. His eyes darted around the shop. Clamps, saws, strings. Strings. You don't care about the tone, Elias spat. You're tone-deaf. A man who hears music doesn't hurt people. Vane laughed softly. On the contrary, violence is the oldest rhythm of all. He gestured to the mercenary holding the laptop. Wipe it, then burn the shop. Make it look like an electrical fire. Faulty wiring in an old building. Tragic. And us? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Vane didn't answer. He didn't have to. He began to turn toward the door, the gold top in his hand. Wait, Elias shouted. Vane paused. Begging? It doesn't suit you. The ledger, Elias said, breathing hard. The digital copy isn't the only evidence. The paper inside. You didn't check it. Vane frowned. He looked down at the guitar. The cavity was empty, save for the wiring. The ledger is in the laptop case, is it not?
No, Elias lied.
The physical ledger was indeed in Sarah's bag. But Vane didn't know the specifics of Luthery. There's a secondary chamber. Under the fretboard. A resonance chamber. Your father hid a microfilm strip there. If you burn the shop, you burn the film, but the metal canister will survive. Forensics will find it. Vane's eyes narrowed. He was a collector, but he wasn't a technician. The anatomy of a guitar was a mystery to him. Show me. Let her go, Elias bargained. Show me, and I'll make it quick, Vane countered. Elias stepped forward. He moved slowly, hands raised. He walked past the mercenary, past Sarah, to the workbench where Vane stood. The smell of the turpentine was overpowering now. Dizzying. Give me the guitar, Elias said. Vane hesitated, then handed the instrument to Elias, keeping his other hand near the inside of his jacket. One wrong move, Mr. Thorne, and I will have my associate dismantle Miss Miller while you watch. Elias took the gold top. The weight of it was familiar, grounding. He held it by the neck. He looked at the fretboard, pretending to inspect the inlay at the 12th fret. Well? Vane demanded, stepping closer. Elias looked at Vane. He saw the arrogance, the absolute certainty of victory. The secret, Elias whispered, is in the tension. Elias didn't reach for a secret compartment. He didn't reach for microfilm. He swung the guitar. He didn't swing it at Vane. He swung it, with all the torque his hips could generate, directly into the face of the Marshall amplifier cabinet. The collision was catastrophic. The seasoned mahogany body of the 1954 Les Paul, worth $250,000, shattered against the heavy birch ply of the speaker cabinet. The sound was like a gunshot, a splintering crack that echoed in the confined space. But it was what happened next that mattered. Elias had swung the guitar so the output jack, still trailing a cable he had covertly plugged in moments before the breach, ripped free. But the sheer force knocked the heavy amplifier stack backward. The top cabinet toppled. Vane, reacting to the sudden violence, flinched back. The heavy speaker cabinet crashed down exactly where he had been standing a split second before, clipping his shoulder and sending him sprawling into the puddle of turpentine and varnish. Run! Elias screamed. The mercenary with the gun hesitated, his line of sight blocked by the falling equipment. In that second of chaos, Sarah moved. She grabbed a can of spray lacquer from the shelf and hurled it at the mercenary's head. It connected with a dull thud, and the man staggered. Elias didn't wait to see if Vane was down. He grabbed Sarah's hand and bolted not for the back door, where the other guard was, but for the stairs leading to the basement storage. Shoot them! Vane shrieked from the floor, his voice losing its polished veneer, turning into a guttural roar of pain. Bullets chewed into the doorframe as Elias and Sarah threw themselves down the stairs. Splinters of wood rained down on them like confetti. They tumbled into the darkness of the basement, the smell of damp earth rising to meet them. The window! Elias gasped, pulling Sarah up. The basement had a high coal chute window that opened onto the alley, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. Elias dragged a crate over. Above them, heavy boots pounded on the floorboards. "Go, Sarah, go!" She scrambled up the crate, unlatched the chute, and clawed her way out into the rain-slicked alley. Elias followed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He heard the basement door kick open just as he hauled himself through the narrow opening. He fell onto the wet asphalt of the alley, scraping his palms raw. Sarah was already up, pulling him to his feet. "My bag," she panted, clutching the strap over her shoulder. "I still have the physical ledger." "The guitar," Elias choked out, staring at the closed chute. "I destroyed it." "You saved us," she said, pulling him. "Come on." They ran. They ran through the labyrinth of Pioneer Square alleys, the rain lashing at their faces, disguising their tears and their sweat. Behind them, the faint glow of fire began to flicker in the window of the shop. The turpentine had found a spark. Elias didn't look back. He couldn't. He had just sacrificed the holy grail of guitars, a piece of history, to buy them a few seconds of life. He felt a phantom pain in his hands, the vibration of the wood shattering, the death of the instrument. But as they rounded the corner, disappearing into the anonymity of the Seattle night, Elias realized something. Vane had wanted the legacy. He had wanted the object. Now Vane had nothing but splinters and ash. "Where do we go?" Sarah shouted over the wind. Elias looked at his trembling hands, then at the woman who held the truth in her bag. The hunter had become the hunted, but the game had changed. Vane was hurt, angry, and exposed. "We finish it," Elias said, his voice hardening, taking on the steel of the strings he used to wind. "He burned my shop. He threatened my life. But he forgot one thing." "What?" "The music doesn't stop just because you break the instrument," Elias said, wiping the rain from his eyes. "We go to the broadcast tower. If we can't upload it, we broadcast it." "The pirate signal?" Sarah asked, eyes widening. "Elias, that's old tech. That's analog. Vane controls the digital world," Elias said, starting to run again, the adrenaline numbing his pain. "So we beat him with the one thing he can't hack. We beat him with the airwaves." They sprinted into the dark, leaving the wreckage of the past behind, racing toward a frequency that would bring the whole house of cards tumbling down. The collector had arrived, but he had left empty-handed. And now the strings of deception were about to snap. The air in the abandoned subway station didn't just smell stale. It smelled of time stopped violently. It was a cocktail of iron dust, brackish water dripping from the cracked vaulted ceiling, and the ozone scent of high-voltage memories that had long since dissipated. Elias Thorne stood in the center of the platform, the cracked mosaic tiles beneath his boots crunching like dry bones. In his right hand, he gripped the handle of the battered tweed guitar case, the coffin, as Sarah had grimly christened it 3 days ago. It felt heavier than the wood and wire inside should account for. It carried the weight of 1954, of a dead man's legacy, and of a lie that Elias was about to bet his life on. "Check your 6, Sarah's voice crackled in his earpiece. A tiny, comforting ghost in his auditory canal. Thermal shows 3 heat signatures moving down the north tunnel. Vane isn't alone.
Surprise, surprise.
"I never expected him to come solo, Docs," Elias murmured, keeping his lips barely moving. He adjusted the collar of his coat against the subterranean chill. "Just tell me you're in position. I'm in the rafters. I've got the localized EMP rigged to the junction box. If this goes south, I kill the lights. You'll have 3 seconds of total darkness before their eyes adjust to the tack lights. Make them count." 3 seconds is an eternity," Elias said, though his heart hammered a rhythm that disagreed. He looked down the tunnel. The darkness there was absolute, a heavy velvet curtain that seemed to swallow the faint ambient light filtering down from a great 4 stories above. Then, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of dress shoes on concrete echoed against the curved walls. It was a precise, arrogant sound. Julian Vane emerged from the shadows like a shark gliding through murky water. He wore a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than the station had cost to build. His silver hair swept back, his face a mask of cultivated indifference. Flanking him were two men who looked like jagged rocks stuffed into cheap suits. Shoulders too wide, eyes too dead. Vane stopped 10 yards away, just outside the pool of pale light where Elias stood. "Mr. Thorne," Vane said. His voice was smooth, a baritone that resonated perfectly in the acoustic chamber of the tunnel. "You have a flair for the dramatic. The Bleecker Street drop wasn't theatrical enough for you." "I prefer places with multiple exits," Elias replied, tightening his grip on the case. "And no civilians. What we're doing here doesn't need an audience." Vane smiled, a thin stretching of lips that didn't reach his eyes. "There is no audience for history, Elias. Only custodians. And I am the custodian that instrument requires." He took a step forward, his gaze locking onto the tweed case. The hunger in his eyes was naked, terrifying. It was the look of an addict staring at a loaded syringe. "Is it inside?" Elias lifted the case and set it onto a rusted metal drum standing nearby. The 1954 Gibson Les Paul Goldtop. The prototype. The one that never made it to the shipping log. "Open it." "Not yet," Elias said, his hand hovering over the latches. "We have business." Vane sighed, a sound of profound boredom. "The money is in the account. 7 figures as requested. You can check your phone, provided you get service in this tomb." "I don't want the money, Julian." Vane paused. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant, rhythmic dripping of water. "We are past the point of negotiation. You stole from my private vault. You embarrassed me. The money was a courtesy to ensure the item remained undamaged. If you don't want money, you are either a fool or a martyr. Neither has a long life expectancy in my world." "I want the ledger," Elias said. The temperature in the station seemed to drop 10 degrees. The two goons shifted, hands drifting toward the bulges under their jackets. Vane didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed to slits. "The ledger," Vane repeated softly. "You're overreaching." "The Blackwood Ledger," Elias clarified, his voice gaining strength. "The book that proves your grandfather didn't just acquire his collection during the war. He looted it. He liquidated families to build his gallery. That guitar isn't just wood and strings. It's the proof of ownership for the entire Gibson legacy theft." "Docs, watch the big one on the left," Elias whispered subvocally. "He's twitching. I have him." Sarah's voice came back, tight with tension. "Don't push him too hard, Elias. Vane is a sociopath, not a businessman." Vane laughed, a dry, barking sound. "You think a dusty book of accounts matters? I own judges. I own senators. History is written by the victors, Mr. Thorne, and my family won a long time ago." "Then you won't mind trading it," Elias said. He flipped the latches on the case. Click, click, click. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet. He lifted the lid. Even in the dim, subterranean light, the guitar was breathtaking. The gold finish, aged and checked with the spiderweb cracks of 60 years, glowed with a dull, inner fire. The curve of the body, the trapeze tailpiece, it was a masterpiece of mid-century luthery. It smelled of nitrocellulose lacquer and old mahogany. Vane audibly inhaled. He took another step, drawn by an invisible wire. "Beautiful," he whispered. The discordant note. The flaw in the production line that became perfection. "The ledger, Julian," Elias said, moving his hand to the neck of the guitar. He didn't caress it, he gripped it. He pulled a Zippo lighter from his pocket and flicked it open. The flame danced, reflecting in the gold top of the instrument. Vane froze. "You wouldn't." "Nitrocellulose is highly flammable," Elias said, his voice deadly calm. "It burns fast and hot. 1 second of contact and the finish bubbles. 5 seconds and the wood catches. You'll have a pile of ash and hardware before your gorillas can cross the room." "You're bluffing," Vane hissed, the veneer of sophistication cracking. "You're a musician. You can't destroy art." "I'm a survivor," Elias countered, lowering the flame inches from the headstock. And I know that this guitar is the only thing keeping me alive. Hand over the ledger, or I burn the legacy down right here. Vane stared at the flame, then at Elias. A vein pulsed in his temple. He raised a hand, snapping his fingers. The thug on the right reached into his jacket. Elias tensed, ready to drop the lighter, but the man pulled out a thick, leather-bound notebook, not a gun. He tossed it through the air. It landed with a heavy slap on the wet tiles between them. There, Vane spat. The sins of the father. It's useless to you. You can't publish it without incriminating yourself in the theft. I'm not publishing it, Elias said. Kick it over. Vane nodded to the thug who kicked the book across the gap. Elias stopped it with his boot, never taking his eyes off Vane, never moving the flame from the guitar. Docs, I'm looking through the scope, Sarah whispered. The binding matches the archival photos. It looks real. Grab it and let's go. Elias crouched, snatching the book while keeping the guitar between him and the men. He shoved the ledger into his coat pocket. Now, Vane said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. The guitar. Step away. Elias stood up. He looked at the instrument one last time. It really was beautiful. It's all yours, Julian. He snapped the lighter shut and backed away, hands raised. Vane didn't wait. He lunged forward, ignoring his bodyguards, and fell to his knees before the open case. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the vintage gold finish. He looked like a man praying at an altar. Checking the serial number, Vane muttered, pulling a jeweler's loop from his pocket. He peered at the back of the headstock. 7, 4, 1. Yes. He exhaled, a sound of pure ecstasy. Then he stopped. He leaned closer. He rubbed his thumb over the tuning peg. He scratched gently at the binding on the neck. The patina, Vane whispered. It's chemically accelerated. Elias was already 10 feet back, near the tunnel exit. You have a sharp eye, Julian. Sarah does excellent work, doesn't she? It's a fake, Vane roared, his voice echoing violently off the tiles. A forgery. It's a 1956 reissue, Elias corrected. Still a nice guitar. Plays great. But the 54? Kill him, Vane screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Elias. Kill him now. The two bodyguards moved with terrifying speed, weapons drawn. Docs! Now! Elias yelled. Zio! A high-pitched whine shrieked through the station, followed instantly by a thunderous crack. The junction box high on the wall exploded in a shower of sparks. The hanging lights blew out in sequence. Pop, 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 plunging the station into absolute, suffocating darkness. Move, Elias! Move! Sarah screamed in his ear. Elias didn't need telling. He spun and sprinted into the black mouth of the south tunnel. Behind him, muzzle flashes lit up the platform like strobe lights, brief snapshots of chaos. Bang! Bang! A bullet chipped the concrete inches from his head, sending stone shrapnel into his cheek. He didn't slow down. He knew the station. He had walked it 3 times with Sarah, counting the steps. 40 paces to the turnstile. Jump. Left at the ticket booth. Thermal shows them pursuing. Sarah guided him, her voice calm amidst the chaos. Vane is staying with the fake. The 2 muscle are on your tail. You have 50 meters to the service ladder. Elias's lungs burned. The air here was thicker, choked with the smoke from the blown transformer. He could hear the heavy boots of the pursuers crashing through the dark behind him. They were fast. I need a distraction, Docs. Deploying audio countermeasures. Suddenly, the station's PA system, which Sarah had hijacked hours ago, roared to life. But it wasn't a voice. It was feedback, a screeching, distorted loop of guitar noise, amplified to ear-splitting levels. It was the sound of a Marshall stack pushed to 11, bouncing off the tiled walls, disorienting and painful. Elias heard one of the men scream in confusion behind him. The acoustic assault covered the sound of Elias's footsteps. He reached the service ladder. It was a rust-caked skeleton of iron climbing up a ventilation shaft. He slung his arms around the rungs and hauled himself up, the muscles in his back screaming. Below him, a beam of tactical light cut through the gloom, sweeping the floor where he had been seconds ago. Up, 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 he chanted to himself. He climbed until his hands were raw. The air grew fresher, the smell of rain and city exhaust replacing the stagnant tomb below. He reached the top, shoved the grate open, and rolled out onto the wet pavement of a dark alleyway in Tribeca. Rain lashed against his face, felt like baptism. A black van screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley. The side door slid open. Sarah Miller sat there, surrounded by monitors and radio equipment, her face illuminated by the blue glow of screens. She looked like a cyberpunk Valkyrie. "Get in!" she yelled. Elias dove into the van, slamming the door shut just as the vehicle peeled away, tires smoking on the wet asphalt. He collapsed onto the metal floor, gasping for air, his chest heaving. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the leather-bound book. Sarah spun her chair around, her eyes wide. "Is everyone intact?" "I think so," Elias wheezed, wiping a smear of blood from his cheek. "He bought it. For about 30 seconds, he bought it." 30 seconds was all we needed, Sarah grinned, though her hands were shaking slightly. "And the real 54? Elias tapped the floorboards of the van. Underneath a pile of cables, a second guitar case, scuffed, nondescript, lay hidden. "Safe," Elias said. "Vane has a very expensive piece of firewood. We have the evidence, and we have the legacy." Sarah looked at the ledger in Elias's hand. "So what now? We release the book? Send Vane to prison?" Elias ran his hand over the cover of the Blackwood ledger. He thought about the fear in Vane's eyes when the lighter was close to the guitar. He thought about the history of theft and blood that had birthed the collection. "Prison is too good for him," Elias said, sitting up and looking out the rear window at the receding city lights. "Vane cares about one thing, his reputation as a connoisseur, his legacy." He opened the ledger. Rows of names, dates, and stolen items filled the pages. It was a map of destruction. "We don't give this to the police," Elias said, a hard smile forming. "We give it to the families. Every single item listed here has a rightful heir. We use the ledger to return the collection, piece by piece. We dismantle his life's work from the inside out." Sarah's eyes lit up. "He'll be ruined. Death by 1,000 lawsuits. Better," Elias said. "He'll be irrelevant." He reached over and pulled the real case toward him. He popped the latches. This time there was no deception. The 1954 Gibson Les Paul gold top lay inside, truly ancient, truly perfect. It wasn't just a guitar. It was a survivor just like them. Elias plucked the E-string. The note rang out, clear and sustained, cutting through the hum of the van's engine. It wasn't discordant anymore. It was resolved. "Drive docks," Elias said, closing his eyes and listening to the note fade into the night. "We have a lot of deliveries to make." The van turned the corner, disappearing into the labyrinth of New York City, leaving the underground and its ghosts far behind. The song was over, but the music, the real music, was just beginning.